Let's start building this server. We'll start by opening up our project in our code editor. Use whatever editor you're most comfortable with. If you installed Visual Studio Code at the beginning of this course, you will probably have the command line shortcut. So type in code and then space dot in the command line to open up our first server project. So here it is. I'm going to go ahead and make this full screen. Now, if you're wondering what that full screen feature was, I have this tool called SizeUp installed on my Mac, which allows me to easily move things around. For example, I can put things in corners on the left, top, bottom, or right, and make things full screen very quickly. Now, it's a paid application, but a little investment towards improving your developer life is usually worth it, so consider going to SizeUp and using it. Here we have our project with its package.json file. Now, if we open up the package.json file, you'll find that the main field points to an index.js file. This essentially means that the root of our project will be a JavaScript file called index.js. Well, we don't have that file at the moment, so let's create it. I'm going to go ahead and use Visual Studio Code to create an index.js file. And there we have our index.js file. For our very first step, let's write some code that will allow us to create a web server. We'll require a module called HTTP to do this. Now, there's two concepts to unpack in that statement. First, we have the idea of modules. Modules in Node represent packages of code that allow us to add certain features to our JavaScript Node applications. In the case of HTTP, HTTP is a core module to Node, so we don't have to install it separately. We can use it right away, since it's included in Node.js's source code. So we'll grab our HTTP module and store it in a constant object called HEP, or rather HTTP, and then we'll require the HTTP module just like so. So we point to the module with a string, and then we use the global require function that Node.js provides for us. Before we move on, let's clarify HTTP. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and it's a standard for transferring data and communicating across the web. It essentially allows us to transfer data through hyperlinks across web pages full of text. In our case, we're making a server in this HTTP protocol format. All right, now that we have the HTTP module, let's cover the next two steps: defining our host name and our port for the web server. In networking, a host name is a label assigned to the server to identify it to other applications on the web. For example, domain names like Facebook and Google are officially established host names in the domain name system of the internet. For our purposes in development, we can attach to the localhost host name, which is a host name that hooks up to the local computer. So, create a hostname variable with the value of localhost in a string. We're going to create a constant called hostname, all one word, and then it'll be a string with a value of localhost. Next, we have the concept of a port. A port number is a way to identify our particular server program on the local network as a running process. Another typical development port number is 3000. So let's create a port variable and then have it be 3000. Great. With our hostname and port now, we're ready to create our server. So let's create a new server constant, and then we'll store our server object in this constant. To create our server, we'll use a function from HTTP called createServer, given to us through the HTTP module and now stored in this HTTP object. So we'll set it equal to http.createServer and call that function by using its parentheses. Now, createServer takes one argument, which is a callback function that allows us to specify different options for the server. This callback function has two arguments itself, called rec and res, which are short for an incoming request and the response of our server. So let's provide in an arrow function. And then for its parameters, we'll have our rec and res objects. Let's expand out this function as well. For our server, let's immediately respond with a message by using response.end or res.end to respect our parameter. The end function for the response object signals to our server that we have finished all configuration. The end function itself takes in the data that we want to respond with. Let's respond with a string that greets a user and says, "Welcome to Node." So we'll call the end function within this response res object, and then we could provide a string that says, "Welcome to Node." And you can put an exclamation point to make it all the more exciting. Great, we're nearly there. We have a server configured. Now, we have to start up the server to allow it to begin accepting connections on our specified port and host name. To start up the server, we want it to start listening for requests. As such, we have the server.listen function. So let's call the server.listen function that our server has. And one way to configure this listen function is by passing in the port and host name as the first two parameters. So we'll provide the port, which is 3000, and then we'll also provide our host name, which is our localhost string. Then for the final parameter, we'll provide a function that will serve as a callback that fires once the server is actually listening. Let's provide a function that logs a message to the console that the server is running. We'll also use an E6 template literal string made with backticks to efficiently log that we're listening at our hostname under the specified port number. So we'll provide our callback function with an arrow function, and then we won't have any parameters for this callback, but we will have some code that says console.log the fact that, and we're using a template string here, so we can achieve string interpolation more quickly. And then we use the $, curly brace syntax to insert a variable. So we're just going to say that we're listening at the host name, or rather that we're running at the host name. And then we'll say after a colon that we're also doing so at the specific port number. Great. With that console.log down, we have our code ready to fire. Head back to the terminal, and within the first server directory, let's invoke the node program and run our index program that we just created. So this tells Node to start up the index.js file, and then we have our message that the server is now running at localhost port 3000, so it's listening. To test this, let's head to a new browser window. Here we are. And then we're going to go to localhost 3000. And as we do so, we have a message that greets us that says, "Welcome to Node." Perfect. Our first Node server is working. Congrats. Before we move on though, let's take one more step to get further in line of what's typical of a Node application project. Usually to start up our app, we use a command npm start. With the start command, npm will look at the script section of our package.json file and run whatever is listed next to start. So let's head to our package.json file, find package.json, and notice our scripts right now only have the test. Well, we can add a second one and be sure to use strings. We'll have start, and as the value, we'll have the command we entered into the command line to fire the application, which was node index. And as we save this, we can head back to our terminal now. And with only one command, this extra layer of the npm start script might feel over the top. But imagine an application that needs to fire 2 or even 10 different commands to fire up the server. Well, we can capture all of those commands within the start script for npm. Suddenly, npm start is looking very convenient. Plus, many host providers for Node specifically look at the npm start field in order to know how to properly fire up the application. All right, within our command line now, let's stop the server by doing Control-C. And now rather than using node index, we'll say npm start. And as we do so, we see that we're running our node index. command, and then the server is listening. And again, if we hit our browser, we see on a refresh that again we have welcome to Node on localhost 3000. Perfect. Our server is listening on localhost 3000 as normal. Let's move on and continue improving this first HTTP server with Node.